Welcome into the Energy Tech Podcast. For today, we are recording part 6 of our Control Room Management mini-series as Mike and Daniel will be discussing SCADA HMI standards. Guys, welcome to Canonsburg.
Hey, Jeff, thanks for that intro. I am your co-host, Mike Flores with the Energy Tech Podcast, live right here in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, in the heart of the OpSite Energy Control Center. Again, with my guest, our expert, our VP of Regulatory Compliance, Mr. Daniel Nieto. Daniel, thanks for being on the show and moving through this mini-series, man.
Yeah, it's great to be here and cover this, this portion of the mini-series. Make sure to go over 1165. So hopefully we get some good information out there for everyone.
Yeah, let's kick this off because, this to me has some misnomers with it that we can address. Last year in 2025, I was in a conversation with a midstream company. Actually, I was consulting for them, and this was one of the topics. The reason I bring this up is because they were working with another integrator that presented a report concerning 1165. And because of a lot of the misnomers and confusion, it was applied in the wrong way in terms of the difference between liquid and gas, among other things. So I think it's real important that when you talk about 1165 that you do address this. So I guess what I'm ultimately saying is that what I saw, Daniel, was just, it was kind of like a brush over of 1165. There was no deep review of it at all. And I think that's what brought on us coming and saying, hey, no, let's bring in a team that has spent a lot of time doing that. And I say that because you've spent a lot of time and lots of audits. And so if there's anyone that can add some color and bring clarity, it would be you in terms of 1165 and how the rule fits. So
a lot of people always, when you go into these audits or even just from operations like you stated, they wonder, do they hit what they're, as far as what the expectation is from PHMSA on 1165.
Yeah.
So, this is definitely something that everyone kind of look at, whether or not you're fully regulated or just looking to enhance some of your screens and just really look at it from a perspective of what you can do to enhance your operations from a SCADA screen perspective.
Yeah, and I think it's also good to point out that, typically you may have high performance HMI. I think when you look at 1165, there's great elements that you can implement. That doesn't mean that everything has to be this super high performance. I think you should have those elements because of human factors. Mm-hmm. But no one's, there's things that you can still do on your screens that bring lots of, I'm not going to use the word creativity, I will say, because that opens the door to jumbling screens and junk that we're going to talk about. But I am saying that, if you address a process and you simply say, hey, this is what our screen looks like and we achieved what the federal requirement is, I think you can do that.
And the way you want to take the approach to it is look at what can we do to enhance the awareness of the pipeline.
Yes, exactly.
That's what this overview or what this episode is pretty much about, is hitting up on some of those and those items and situational awareness for the controller.
Yeah. And so let's get in here, Daniel. Let's talk about why this episode even matters. Guide us through this, man. Why does this episode matter and what do we expect in the episode?
Yeah, we definitely want to, make sure that we're, looking at from a controller's perspective and what we're placing in front of them to make sure that we're responding to any type of abnormal conditions, right? So, and that's what the controllers are acting on, and that's the importance of it under stress, just like we have here, and making sure that we're not cluttering the screens, that the information is there for them where, they're not second guessing or it's slowing down that reaction time, right? We want to make sure that we, provide a screen that they can utilize. And it's, like you said, you you want high performance, but you're also trying to identify what works for your operations.
That's right. And I think that's the key right there. It's not everyone needs a super Corvette. Really what you're looking to see is, does this fit for our operation?
Yes. Gain that feedback from, and we'll go through it on the slides, but, as we identify in here, it's, looking at how this works for your operations, for your controllers, and making sure that, overall for 1165 and from any audit, just your documentation and making sure that you have something implemented, right? What is your process?
Yeah. So I think in this episode, you'll take us through the sections in the rule, what 1165 actually brings, which is clarity and lots of consistency, kind of discuss a little bit of the impractical provisions, documenting them. And then, we'll cover some action items that are really important for 1165. And then, when does it even apply, right? And there's some, when you're going to add or expand or replace, we'll talk about that. And then, as usual, Daniel, in these episodes, you've given us some good real world examples just based on your own heavy experience, for poor and better screens. We might even talk about a couple of them. And then we always want to leave you, as usual, Daniel, you're leaving us with that 4-step implementation path, a framework, if you will, in the episode that if you're listening in, you can take away from, right? And the other thing is, speaking of takeaways, 2 things. If you want to take anything away from this, definitely like and subscribe to us and put your comments in here. We want your scenarios. If you're a control room operator, manager, supervisor, someone that's involved in regulatory, you spend time with operators, producers, and you're left with the task of setting up a CRM plan or moving in that direction, give us a scenario. No one's asking you to list a producer and indict anybody. What we are asking for is a good scenario that maybe you want to talk through. We'd be happy to cover it. I think that would be great. So with that, Daniel, take us through, man. I mean, let's talk about the regulatory context and why it's important in liquid and gas.
Yeah. So as far as, like you stated, I mean, you really want to make sure that you're doing this from, designing for the controller and performance of, safety overall. That's what it's all about. Making sure that we're hitting those things, right?
Yep.
And as we listed out here, as far as requirements, identifying, for your SCADA system, whether that's adding, expanding, or replacing, the importance of that and having that documentation, right? So implementing 1165, the situational awareness here and documentation, and how that works for your operations. Maybe you're not able to do or able to implement 1165 based off of your SCADA system, right? It's all about documentation, having that record in place.
So you bring something important to that part. What you're saying is this is where the word impractical falls into the federal rule, meaning it's impractical for the operation to add something or expand on something on a screen because we don't have the ability to do that, right? So when in here, the federal rule points to some impracticality, right? Is that kind of where that fits in?
Yeah. So, the questions or the question set in this section are going to ask you, what triggers 1165 requirements, right?
Right.
So you have that, and then you also, whether or not you can implement that, right? So now it's about deviations if you're not able to.
Right. So if you have a section 1165, you need to clearly, in your SCADA display standard, call that out and say why.
Correct.
Right.
Because, the biggest thing is, you don't want to go into an audit and they ask you, well, why didn't you apply 1165? And you're there and you point to your SCADA engineer and say, well, he knows about 1165, right? It's about having some type of manual, having some documentation that you're following your own standards, you're implementing within your environment for, your operations. And that's really how you're doing your implementation from maybe it's a new SCADA system, maybe it's a, just an upgrade,
Right.
Or from, the pipeline, segments or new assets. So you definitely want to have that defined. You have a scope written on how you add those things, or, because it could be, a major change or a minimal change. And that's where people get confused on what triggers what. Well, when you go into an audit, you have to have this documentation in place, because they're going to ask you what triggers these things, right? They want to know what's triggering a change and how are you documenting that. Well, it's not, I know 1165. Well, that person may not always be there. So
right.
You're going back to some type of, plan or procedures that have that laid out for you guys.
So when someone's pointing to the standard, I recognize that they're going to point to some Q&A plus the document itself. But the reality is, when we talk about the standard, Daniel, are we talking about, when you say documentation, aside from having the document completed 1165, is this where someone's going to create their accompanying style guide?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's exactly what we're talking about here, creating their own style guide on what that process looks like.
Right.
For any type of, redesign, major changes, or what you're doing from a standpoint and how you're introducing that into the control room. When you look at this, you need to make sure that you don't want to be trying to figure this out in the audit, right?
Right.
They're looking for answers because you've been, probably operating the system for some time already.
Right.
And you want to be able to show them your process and be able to speak to that process and not point to a person and say, this is what our process is.
So that's part of if you look at 1165, that is part of the display standard. It's typical. You're going to point to a style guide. And so in this, regulatory context, this is why it's important. In your core requirements here, we've listed out, you talk about the trigger. That's important. I think of the trigger as the executive summary, if you will. You're basically saying, this is why. This is why we're doing. This is what's being added. This is what triggered it for an expansion, right? We had a new SCADA system. We, whatever the case was. And then this is what we've implemented, and you point through each section, and then you're going to include that situational awareness and document any part of that is, okay, this is not practical for us, and then list any sort of deviation in that same documentation, right? Those are the kind of the building blocks.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, and you got to remember from the guidance that PHMSA provides, right? It's, we have in scope and what's typically out of scope.
Yes.
So you'll have, whether it's new assets or new segments of pipelines that are being added, you want to make sure that you have your design process in place. This is the recommended practice that PHMSA is pushing for us to utilize and use within your operations,
right? And
how that looks like, right, for your operations. So you got to remember that from the guidance, you have to be able to identify in scope and what are some minor changes that are not typically in scope.
Right.
So that could be like we have here, some typos, some updates, as far as you can have some updates that don't impact display parameters, right?
Right.
That are necessarily going to trigger 1165.
Right.
But you do have some, but you have to be able to identify that if it's a symbol, it could be colors, it could be the just controller interface. So say you have something that's incorrectly displayed, or say you're adding a new point, you have to look at that from the guidance perspective of how that impacts. Because maybe it's not a typical in scope. You're maybe adding a new point, right? But does it hit symbols, colors, and that interface for the controller as far as it being displayed? Right.
All you did was really bring in a value that someone can display, but it still falls in the guardrail of it doesn't impact the in scope stuff.
Correct.
Right? It's kind of like It's just those were minor cosmetic changes that do not change the scope of the documentation. It doesn't change, hey, we just added another pressure transmitter, and that pressure value, it's going to be point-to-point tested, but at the same time, it's visible and it still follows the same guardrail path that's in scope. Nothing's changed there.
Right, and it's about, you already have something in place as far as, again, and you're adding an additional point.
Right.
So you're good from that perspective. And, you just want to make sure that you have a document that states how this is, rolled out and what that process looks like.
Yeah. So let's walk through these right now. If we're talking in scope, these are the big ones, the heavy hitters. A new SCADA platform is implemented, a new system, or a major version upgrade. That typically happens with, some of the SCADA system platforms that are out there. An example is like Wonderware. I went from version, I went from InTouch to system platform. Well, there's some changes there. So, if I did that, if you're someone that's accustomed to Ignition, 8.3 left out something, that's where you're going to see that sort of major version change. Or, then you've got new assets, right? You've mentioned that already. We've got a new pipeline segment. And let's identify that when we talk about pipeline segment, that could be, hey, we have a new single valve that we just added that is, hey, Mike, it's only like, 30 feet of pipe. Like it doesn't matter. It's a new segment added that is either safety related, or it's a new segment that our station or a new control room even, right? So that's important too. It's not just, hey, we laid a whole new pipe that takes us, a mile. We're saying, hey, there might even be a small section where you're going to need to do that. And then significant redesign. I think when it comes to significant redesign, this is where you have to be careful and just make sure that, if I'm correct, I think you got to make sure that you have, that you measure the in scope and out of scope, the major changes. Always err on the side of in scope if it's a major change.
Yeah, because it may not trigger something,
Right.
So, and here's the thing is you have to have this in place where you can go to and review it. And everything that you're adding is based off of this information. And to stay, even to go a little further, you want to make sure that you're adding this, and we're going to get into this later on in the conversation, and we'll bring it up again. But, you want to make sure that you're, if this is being triggered, you want to make sure that you're adding it to your management change.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
And that's your documentation to map back to, yes, we updated our 1165. We do have that, but we're mapping back to our management of change. We can go map that and see when we did that.
And everyone has their own management of change and their forms, and utilizing the FAQs and utilizing what PHMSA has out. Asking yourself the question, how does this, this change, does it affect SCADA? How does it work, as far as the 1165 when you're rolling out these new projects, or, it could be, again, what we listed out here. It'd be multiple things, right?
Yes. Yeah. The other thing too is, one of the things it calls out in scope is your, we're going to call that a critical detail screen. So you may have the initial let's say it's a pipeline overview or a station overview, but you decide to add some diagnostics that add to the overall view of the control room. Like, hey, I need to go to this diagnostic to take a look at something that might be safety related, right? You need to make sure that you're documenting that. That's part of in scope, right? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And then again, tying it back to your management change, that's, as that's also triggered, right?
Right.
For something that's critical on your screen, and definitely whether or not it's redesign, because you want to make sure that the controllers know where everything is at on the screen.
Yes. And the other thing for critical detail is if you're adding a button to stop and start and it's in a third and a second level change, that needs to be documented. That needs to be in your in scope. So that's another detail that sometimes, well, we're just adding the button here. No, that is part of, it triggers a change. Yep. An operator's whole understanding of the tools that he has. He now has to, second level button, I do that. That needs to be documented as part of in scope, even though it seems minor.
Yeah, because your redesign could be, you're looking at your hierarchy and maybe you're trying to minimize what's on that screen.
Yeah.
What you're trying to reduce as far as clutter.
Yep.
And what's more situational awareness for, that controller on that console to improve response.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah, so walk us, we'll finish up this slide, Daniel. We've got that regulatory expectation. At the end of the day, operators, they have to define and document their internal criteria that's either adding or expanding or replacing their the definition. And then any decisions that are applicable, they just need to be consistent and written. You need to be able to return to it and defensible in an audit, right?
Yes. So again, I can't stress this enough. We've been through so many audits that when you talk about your design and what your design manual looks like, right, and how you're implementing, anywhere from just the symbols and how you're rolling that out to the control room, the testing environment, when you're doing rationalization. I mean, all that ties into what 1165 is talking about.
Yeah.
And, you want to make sure that, again, this is a part of the tools, from the last episode rolling into this one, how, this is displayed for the controller. And this is obviously to help them enhance operations to try to mitigate any type of emergencies due to clutter and due to too much data being on the screen.
So we'll talk about what 1165 brings to the table, but before we go there, Daniel, I have a question.
Yeah.
What about when someone implements a training system? Does that need to fall into 1165, and you need to have that as part of your complete style guide and your documentation as well?
Yes, from the standpoint of you want consistency across whether or not it's a simulation. And again, this is where you identify and do a deviation and document, how, whether you're capable of doing that.
Right.
You want to have that documentation because, again, you're training off of what this looks like. And now you're moving from what this looks like to the actual screen that's going to be on the console. Well, it's not the same.
Right. Yes.
So you have to document these things and the reason why you can't do that the way you would like to.
Right. So what you're basically saying is if I'm in the control room and practically we're using Wonderware, but our training system, which is, something like, let's say, Atmos leak detection, and they created a complete training system that includes that because they're one of the companies that offers that service, right? So then they do it in Ignition or Clear SCADA, but you have a Wonderware system. Well, you're right. So if there's some changes to it and they are not similar, that must be part of the documentation, and that must be added and brought forward in your 1165 style guides and documents, right?
Yes, and it really should be, it really needs to be spelled out correctly within your documentation, because the last thing you want is to go into an audit and try to explain something and then you look at your documentation and it's not written how you just explained it.
Yeah. Well, you've let me ask you this because we're going to move on, but here's a good chance for some questions just because of the experience level. You've got a really good track record, with your audits. I don't think you've been dinged at all, right? Is that a fair statement? I don't know. So you've kind of done the no-hitter. You're kind of like the Nolan Ryan of the industry, and that you've pitched a lot of no-hitters, I'd say. And what I mean is no dings, right, from the Railroad Commission in Texas or PHMSA as a whole. In your experience, what did you find out early? Because otherwise you would have been dinged maybe, right, in the audit itself. So a lot of things that probably you caught were pre-audit. What?
Yeah.
What were some of the things you caught in pre-audit that you saw that maybe stand out for you in 1165 from other operators? You know that, oh, Mike, here's what I saw, and they had to correct this.
A lot of it was the clutter. A lot of it was the clutter of information that was on the screen. There was no hierarchy. You would see a screen and there's just a lot that was there.
Right.
And it was very distracting. There were screens that had grass on the screen.
The little valve. So they still had the valve, the riser, and they had the grass on the bottom of the valve.
They had, and it was, I mean, there was just colors there, and I didn't understand that.
Right.
And I was like, I can't even see the text, and lucky enough that it was under design, when I kind of walked in the door, and I was like, hold on, we need to start from scratch.
Yeah.
Because the way you're presenting this is not working.
Compliant. Yeah.
Yeah. And, and that's kind of before I really dove into, 1165, but, working with that contractor on developing these assets.
Sure.
Kind of walking in there, and I was like, no, this is not just, even before 1165, even, before reading that, just looking at the screen as, how is this going to help the operator?
Right.
That controller on the console, how is this really helping us? And kind of, making things aware, and then looking at documentation and saying, we really need to kind of move away from this style.
Yeah.
And so that was my introduction into 1165. And then also speaking with several consultants at the time, because, again, this was all very new to me.
Yeah.
Kind of walking in the door, not, coming from an established location, and kind of walking into a startup where, they redesigned some of these screens.
Right.
And looking at it and really trying to change what some of the vendors were doing at that time.
Yeah.
That I guess we're doing 1160, or I guess they thought they were doing 1165. But no, we started quickly changing, modifying that before we rolled it out.
Yeah.
So before we rolled it out, and this was some time back.
Well, let's keep marching through here. Let's talk about what 1165 brings to the table pretty quick here, and then correlate that to what are some important questions that the controllers ask when we do this, so how you bring those together. So in core design, it looks like these are the three main things, right? So give us your take on each one of these in terms of clarity, and then the consistent, and then your abnormal.
Well, what we have here is, again, how we listed out the core design of this, but each controller should have questions, right? And there should be a rollout process within your documentation on how this is being tested with your controllers, reviewed with your controllers, and making sure that, the functionality of all of it, is working correctly.
Right.
And that's, so this is why I kind of listed off as far as what's happening right now. How can you achieve what's happening right now? And it's based off of, the hierarchy and things not being so, cluttered at that high level.
Right.
You can't walk in and look at the screen and know what's going on. And as a controller, right, you want to be able to do that. And the other thing is, how am I going to identify, abnormal operations from, are we trending? Well, how are we able to set up trends? And from, it being consistent across the board, all the symbols, the colors, like text, you don't want to look at a screen and, texts are very small,
Right.
Within your style guide, you should identify, again, what type of text you're using, what your shapes,
call outs, and so on.
yeah, exactly. So,
Yep.
What your priorities look like as far as, are you using red for what? You want to make sure that you identify your colors that you're using, whether it's on alarms or even displays. Now, again, this goes back to, the operator and their SCADA group. We're not saying that you can't use any color, right? What we're saying is make sure that you document it within your group, your operations on what we're utilizing.
I do want to ask, I know Jeff's sitting back there in the booth too, so maybe it's for the both of you, but what about audible alarms? Is that covered in 1165 in the audible side?
Well, a lot of it is, it does cover some of the audible alarms. It's asking how that's being, what are you using as far as like if you have your own type of sound wave. But again, the biggest part of it is how you're identifying, the symbols and displays and how you're rolling that out. You want to be consistent across the board within your own philosophy and how, you're managing your alarms. You just want to make sure that, again, that's identified from a critical standpoint.
Got it. So
the short answer, no. The short answer is no, that Audible is not part of the scope of that document. So,
yeah. So
according to ChatGPT.
According to ChatGPT, wow.
Well, that could be wrong.
Yeah.
But overall, I mean, you're going to point to something, right?
Yes.
So your style guide is going to go over your layouts, how you're displaying that, and then you're also looking at from the standpoint of, how you're rationalizing it. We'll go into that a little later, but overall, it is making sure that the alarms, say you have an alarm that's blinking, right, and it's an audible alarm, it's critical, but you have a valve status or a pump status that's right next to it, and it's red as well. And, you have so much color on your screen that you kind of glance at it and you don't see that it's blinking red on the screen because there's something that's red right next to it,
Right.
And again, it's just trying to remove some of that.
And then I think you speak to something important because then that leans into the priority. So what I'm hearing is 1165 brings some core design. We show these. We talk about clarity over clutter is an important piece. You've got to have your consistent colors and symbology, just like you're talking about, avoiding, lots of decorative grass, on a riser. You want to maintain a cognitive consistency because operators come on shift and they, you do memorize. You remember that's part of the human performance. And then you have your abnormal detection support. So when you marry that up, if you're looking at the right-hand side of, however you're looking at the slide, the blue area, you're really asking yourself these 3 questions to help yourself out. What's happening right now? Can I look at that screen and determine what's happening operationally? Do I have oversight? Do I have control? Do I have that visibility? Number 2 is anything abnormal or trending badly. Can I spot that quickly at that view? And then 3rd is, what are my priorities? Because if I'm getting it in a blinking fashion with an alarm, I have to the controller has to quickly know, okay, I got to take this alarm first. It's not just my first out, this one's a priority. It's established as a priority 1 or whatever your priority levels are, which is what you spell out 1165. So I got that right. There's if you're really looking at design, those are the 3 main elements. You better be asking yourself these questions as you move through the design.
And not only just that, but this has to be within, you want to make sure that, again, if you're triggering an MOC, but even at the design level, having a controller, a part of this process,
yes,
not just reviewing it, but seeing it and how it interacts with actual data, what it looks like if it had data, right? So, this we'll kind of talk about point to point later, but again, it's about how this information is being displayed for the controller and how that looks, again, to answer these 3 questions.
And one point of clarity there, back to the Audible mic, is so API 1165 does not define when you have to use an audible alarm or when it must or must not be used, but it does have some information about if you are going to use them, if you're going to have different ones for different priorities, they need to be distinct. Me and Daniel were even talking earlier about if you have 2 consoles in the same room,
yes,
that you need distinct audible alarms between the consoles as well. So,
Right.
You don't fatigue the operator that's on liquid desk versus gas desk. You know, you got it. So,
got it. That's good to know. So let's move on to this real world. So let's talk about poor versus better HMI. I think we have a couple of examples we could talk about pretty quick here. Let's talk about some before implementation items. I think when we look at this, we're going to see something that's busy, the rainbow or Christmas tree effect, inconsistent colors, that tiny text you're talking about, and then alarms that are buried in that graphic noise. So I think we could talk about that or show that too. I think somebody's got those. We can show that somewhere.
You want to see some bad SCADA screens?
Yeah, man, I want to see a bad SCADA screen.
I did pull a couple examples. Sometimes it's difficult to show screens.
Yeah.
Because of privacy. And,
sure.
Not everyone wants you to know what pipeline is this or that, right?
Right. No, yeah.
And so it can be a pain in the butt to blur things out. But yeah, there's a couple of examples I'll pull in, and these aren't extreme. I'll say that we can pull up some extreme ones.
Yeah. So,
well, I don't have any old SCADA screens where I was talking about. These are actually not too bad.
That's not bad.
Yeah, it's not too bad.
At first glance, I'm going to say this is not bad, but there are a couple things here that you probably want to point out.
Yeah, you do have your tiny text.
Yeah.
Right. You got lots of number. I say lots of number view when you're looking at this. It may look high performance. People might say, "Oh, that's not bad." Right. In fact, you might even see this right here. I'm dressed in field gear. I've been out into the field today, and let me tell you, this is so common right here. Yellow, red, Christmas tree, and subdued gray with just text. I mean, it's just so bad.
Well,
right?
the thing about it too is that it's hard to read these texts, right? So, again, trying to give someone the capability to be able to do a snapshot and looking at these numbers is very difficult to see. And from the standpoint, I'm a trend person, right? So when I was operating, I like to see, my trends, being able to quickly access them and be able to click on something that gave me trends, and that being displayed at kind of a high level as well.
Yep.
Yeah. And color's not forbidden. I mean, there are screens that look like that. So
yeah. We're not saying
they got
it's
the
forbidden.
flow on it too.
And there is actually. I mean, you mentioned there was grass on the pipeline valve. I thought that was funny, but we do have a SCADA screen in our room. Now, this is not for pipeline. This is not for 192, 195. This is for water, produced water, fresh water, things like that. But they do have one that it shows the containments, the water, the pits, and there's even a crawdad in the bottom, like running around.
Well, I mean, I've seen some Wonderware screens where they'll have a flame kind of going. Or a little flyer. It doesn't. I don't know. I guess that's what some of the people wanted back in the day. But for me, it's about information that can help me. Again, kind of speed the process up if I'm trying to identify something.
Yep. Yeah. So that's the before implementation kind of deal there. Alarms buried, things like that. Tiny text. You're really looking for results on faster recognition. Do we have any after? I think there are some that are, high level, clean overview, some standard color, trend line, and then clear abnormal.
Yeah, so I think same screen right here afterwards.
So a little bit more subdued, easier process, fewer lines, consistent text.
Even those lines, as far as like you saw on the other screen where you had arrows throughout the entire pipeline.
Yeah.
Like on the actual pipeline is, it's just the consistency. You want to keep consistency, and like we're saying, we're not trying to take away all color, but as far as if you are, that's fine, but
look at
provide
those,
that information.
What about after on the valves? You see those status. You can kind of look at that status. You do have a better visibility. You have a subdued. I think you can see that tank level, right? You can see a level marker. So you do get a beautiful, less fatiguing, right, to look at, period. So, yeah, definitely some improvement there. Again, what you're seeing, the high level, it's clean. standardized trend line. I think, and then right here you can't see too many trend lines, but usually you'll see that if it's not available in that top, you have that second diagnostic layer. You can click quickly to take a look. And then finally just clear AOC or abnormal operating condition. You should be able to pop up, right? Once I get an alarm and I've established a priority.
Yeah. And you definitely want to be able to get that input from your controller and make sure that, especially if you're redesigning something before you roll it out, if this works for your operations, because it could be something that definitely their feedback is important from that standpoint.
Got it. So let's rock on here. Let's talk about, Daniel, if you don't mind. Let's move into some impractical provisions because it's important for people. We want to clear this up. If an operator chooses not to apply certain provisions in 1165, the rule kind of just expects that formal justification. So walk us through those, the maybe the top 4 things that you want to consider if you're going to be doing some impractical on the provision.
Yeah, so as we laid them out here, 1 through 4, you definitely want to look at what your SCADA system is capable of doing, right? Can you implement? Sometimes you see this where it's on some legacy type of SCADA systems that are still working.
Yeah.
They may not have that functionality. And the thing is, though, is being able to document that and have that documented somewhere. And what you're doing from the standpoint of, okay, say I can't implement 1165, but what are some of your other measures that you're doing to, from a compliance standpoint to make sure that, that you have safety at the forefront. So just having that documented. So, again, if you're not able to do it, justify it, have that documented, and, what are some of the other things that you're doing to help with safety when it comes to the 1165.
Okay. So you have, number 1 is identify, that provision that you're going to pinpoint and talk about, and then you're going to do your rationale. And that third step you have is kind of describe the alternative if you have to, right? Well, the control room itself has this, training SCADA system has the alternative, right? And here's the alternative. That could also be the same for the emergency backup control room, right? Same scenario. You're going to describe any alternative where it is not the same, or you had to kind of detail that different method.
Yes, it's not bad to have deviations on SCADA systems. You just need to be able to spell that out, identify it, and explain why you're deviating.
And then you got to document that decision, right, in your display standard. And that falls back to capturing the record, where you have that, and then also listing that if there's any sort of other documentation you want to do, you point to, right?
Yes, because when you're rolling something out, as far as a part of that record may require training, and your management of change should capture, is there display changes, 1165, new additions, station. So all that's going to, it's going to trigger within your design plan that you're, as far as your 1165 and whatever standard you're going to create for your process, right?
Yeah.
But tying that into your management change is you're always going to have some type of record, and it's going to trigger something. It's going to move that into that area where you can produce and capture a record, especially if you're introducing it into the control room environment that's regulated.
Right. So give us that guidance, Daniel. You've got kind of this 4-step guidance, things that you really just want to focus on. I'm sure we're just reiterating what we've already talked about, but this gives you a little more clarity in terms of the implementation guidance.
Yeah, so what we have here is, again, defining your scope for your projects. So that's like we have, it could be a new SCADA system. It could be, depending on if it's a version, of a SCADA system. So have something defined within your scope, within your process that identifies what triggers what, and try to, tie that into your management of change. Having that a part of the process, when you go into an audit is, all right, so how's this tie into your management of change? And being able to produce that documentation, making sure that those assets, when they go into the control room, you've looked at whether or not there's training involved, training on the screens, based off of the design, and there could be some massive detail changes that are critical for that controller in the control room environment. So tying it to your MOC process, or any projects in general when it comes to, any type of HMI change on 1165 for your SCADA system for this section is a good thing.
All right, and then that second one you've got is just establish those display standards. Really spend time on that style guide. Make sure you've got that and you've got it covered, and then codify the rules for colors and so on that you're going to carry on.
Yeah, because one of the things that they're going to look at is, you're going to have to show screens. You're going to have to go and click on them. They're going to interview your controller and ask them what this means.
Right.
What does the symbol mean? How do you know that you can control it?
Yeah.
They're going to look at discharge pressures. They're going to look at, even suction pressures.
Even a mode status change.
Yeah,
right?
They're going to look at anything that is presented on your SCADA screen during the observation. They're going to ask.
Yeah.
And, they're going to go in there and speak to the controller during that process. And they're going to cover many things. And one of them is this portion of it, looking at the level and the hierarchy of your SCADA system and what information is being, kind of provided in front of them to make sure that they have that, awareness there as far as any type of abnormal.
Yeah. One of the things I want to move on is that step 3, where you're going to apply during design and testing. It's real important that you have a standards checklist. I think, being on the integration and consulting side for us, that's one of the things that we always want to implement is, aside from having your CI/CD or having, your development checklist, things that you're doing, it's important to have just your checklist for making sure that you're meeting the requirements of 1165, even if it's in the form of asking yourself those 3 controller questions that we talked about. It can be formal, very formal, and it can be, hey, let's ask ourselves a series of questions in a checklist. I think that's one. I do want to point something out that I don't, let me give you an example. Sometimes people have contractors that do forms for them, third party, like we did not a PSSR, but a lot of times what they're going to do is they're going to do an acceptance test. And I don't believe that acceptance test passes for a standard checklist, because I don't think that's applying it's not looking at 1165 as a whole. It's just saying, hey, we did this, we did that. There's just a series of steps that aren't as detailed.
Yeah, and again, this is where it kind of ties into multiple things here, right? So anything that you're doing from a design level, you want to make sure you have a process that's going to roll out your management changes. It's going to connect with that.
Yes.
But it's also going to connect with verifying those points, right? So that's kind of your checkout there, right? You want to make sure before you go live that all your checkouts are being done. And especially if this is feeding into some type of, and we'll go into it a little later as far as, verification, because that could feed into your, leak detection systems and so on. But from the standard of, you gain this in front of your controller before you go live, making modifications, testing it all the way through, you want to make sure that you see that data there. You're making sure that the units are correct, making sure that you don't want to have to make those minor changes that we talked about earlier. Yeah. If you can catch it sooner, making sure that your alarms are set up correctly, the full scale set up correctly. You're looking at all those, and making sure that before you roll that out, again, you've involved the controller, you involved the control room, you've made sure that if trainings need to be done, it's not just about markups or, just this is what a screen's going to look like in an email. It's getting down, bringing in the controller and putting it in the screen in front of them and having them navigate and looking at it as you're testing it.
Got it. All right. Well, let's move on to some common misconceptions real quick, Daniel. We've got this one went really long, so let's hone in on a few things. Number one is let's cover some common misconceptions real quick to clear up some confusion and doubt clearing, right? That, again, if you're a control room operator, a supervisor, hopefully what we're talking about is going to help you in terms of some misconception. And let's start with that number one, Daniel. The minor tweaks that trigger, do minor tweaks trigger 1165? And the short answer is no, right?
No, because it could, it could be like we spoke about, it could be some minor changes.
Right.
Adding a point that and again, this goes back to what we stated earlier. You definitely want to look at what that does for your controller and how that's being displayed for your controller.
Got it. So and another misconception is, the question here is, can we align with 1165 without a written standard? And again, this one's the short answer, no. And if I'm correct, you don't want to go in where you say, well, we believe that our SCADA screens are compliant. You're not going to be able to ding us. The reality is that they expect to see that documentation.
Correct. So it's about having a process in place, your procedures in place, and again, that record that's associated with it. Right. And how you're identifying that you checked off these things.
Yeah, you're not going to have your systems integrator come in and go, well, yeah, I think we're compliant. This is more about you need to have that documented.
And no one should do that.
Yeah. So how much freedom do you have in terms of colors and graphics? Because this is probably one of the bigger challenges.
So again, it's about what's going to help your controller, and everyone's going to do things a little differently, like we saw with that one screen.
Yeah,
there was some color there, didn't look too bad, and I've seen screens like that developed, and I've also seen the other grayscale where everything's kind of grayed out, and there's a lot of conversation around that and how everyone is really picking. But again, it goes back to your plan and
those three questions. You had those three questions that tie in earlier.
Yes.
That you want to ask, right?
Yeah.
Ask those questions. I think that really helps clear the fog. So.
Well, yeah, especially from a controller standpoint.
Yeah. Well, let's go into the 3 action items here real quick. Now, you leave us with some really good action items, and I'll go through these pretty quick. I think one of the first ones is you really want to define that scope, as you've said, write that clear criteria, make sure that you're mapping it to a management of change process if you do. The second one is you have iterated that you want to create and update written display standards. Make sure you have them. They're expected to be there for 1165. Make sure your rules and your layouts and your symbology is all codified or organized, to give your consistency. And then finally, document your decisions. Like you said, it doesn't mean just because you have a deviation is not wrong. In fact, you really just want to make sure that you have your documents, you've got your decisions, and you've recorded why you've made those decisions, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's a big part of it. So, you know what, Daniel? I think this has been great, man. For episode 6, you gave us, a lot of information to take back. For this episode 6, in it, we explicitly talked about the SCADA displays, showed a few, talked about operational safety and how you incorporate that with 1165. Make sure you map it to compliance and defining. So I think this was good, man. If you're watching, again, like and subscribe to us. You can go in and make comments. And I'm looking forward to this next episode, Daniel. We're going to talk about point-to-point. This is going to be another one. I think we're going to spend some time on it for point-to-point. So tune in. This is number 6. We're going to jump into number 7 after this and talk about point-to-point, which ties into a little bit of this, but it's going to be a big deal. And then proving that displays actually match and that they're field ready, right?
Yeah. And that's again, it's a huge part, and everyone should really, make sure that they have all these documents in place and verify those.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Daniel. Let's go. Let's keep this going. Don't forget, like and subscribe. And this is Mike Flores, your co-host in the Energy Tech Podcast, as part of the CRM mini-series. Good show.